So we talked about the value, the importance of self-knowledge. We'll be continuing to discuss the issue, why it's important, to what extent it's important, if at all. And we'll be looking at some skeptical doubts, some people who are doubtful of the value of self-knowledge, to see what they've got to say. But in the short term, what I want you to think about next is the way in which self-knowledge seems to bring about a kind of asymmetry, at least for some aspects of the self. And here's what I mean by that, asymmetry. It sometimes goes under the name of privileged access. But for now, let's think about an asymmetry in the following sense. There's a difference between my knowledge of myself and my knowledge of you, some other person, whoever it might be, on certain topics. For example, I seem to know, suppose that there's some damage that's been done to my ankle. Then I can know in a fairly immediate way that I'm experiencing pain as brought about by that ankle. Or at least, even if I don't know where it's coming from, I know that there's something that hurts, I know that there's pain. Or I can know in a fairly immediate way that I'm hungry, or that I'm irritated, or that I'm hopeful about something. Maybe I can also know in a kind of immediate way what it is that's in my mind in the sense of the cognitive component, that is, what I think, what my views are. It seems strange to ask somebody else what I think about a certain topic. If anything, I should ask myself. So, the idea is that I seem to have an asymmetrical relationship between my knowledge of myself. It seems to be asymmetrical relative to your knowledge of me, and likewise for you. You know yourself in a special way compared to the way in which I can know about you. Or at least, that attitude about this asymmetry, so-called privileged access, is a fairly pervasive one in philosophy, and part of what we're trying to explore in this course is the ways in which, the extent to which it might be challenged by the work of other fields. For example, social psychology, where social psychologists are doubtful that this idea of privileged access, asymmetry, is all that it's cracked up to be. But at least on some topics, the notion of asymmetry seems to hold water pretty well. So let's go back to that example of the lemon. Suppose you bite into it and you have that bitter, that sour sensation. Now, it sure seems like you are far and away the best authority on how that lemon tastes to you as compared to someone else. Maybe you're not the best authority on the number of calories you just ingested when you took a bite out of it. Maybe you're not the best authority on the way in which the chemicals from the lemon, the acidity for example, will interact with other things inside of your stomach. Maybe a physiologist, a doctor, a chemist, a biologist will be better authorities on those things than you are. But you seem to be the best authority on whether it tastes sour. And if someone else tries to tell you that it doesn't, it's difficult to see how they could actually show you that you are wrong in your view about how it tastes. So too, suppose somebody asks you your view about who's going to win the next election, or about who you think will be the winner on a show like American Idol or something of the sort that you're about to watch. Now, you might have views about that question, and if you do, you are, once again, far and away the best authority about what you think. Not the best authority on what's going to happen, but the best authority about what's going on inside of your mind. Other people might have views about what you think, but it seems like their way to find out about it is going to be primarily by asking you, as opposed to thinking it through for themselves. If they think it through for themselves, they're going to come up with opinions about their own mind at best, and not about yours. So again, the idea is that you seem to have a special privileged access, an asymmetrical relationship to what's going on inside of your mind. If it's your mind, you seem to know it very well, at least for these cases of the cognitive components, what you believe. Also for certain things like experiences, whether you're in pain, whether something tastes sour, whether something tastes bitter or smells like vanilla. Let's ask about whether or not you have a special access, privileged access to your emotions or your moods. Well, it sure seems like you're in a very good position to know whether or not you're feeling anxious. But notice that somebody else might be able to point out that because you're fidgety, because you can't sit still, because you keep on looking around and so forth, that you're anxious, and you might not have noticed it until that point. So perhaps moods are a little bit different from at least other affects. Moods might be things that you experience, but they might also be things that are manifest in your behavior and dispositions of behavior that other people can find out about as well. So to emotions, somebody might say, hey, Bob is angry at at Bill, even though Bob is not aware of the fact that he's angry at Bill. I can tell Bob's angry at Bill because the way he behaves towards Bill. He's always looking at him in a mean way. He's always cutting off his sentences. He's always speaking to him in kind of a terse, not very gentle or understanding kind of way. Those are all bits of evidence that Bob's angry at Bill, even though Bob says otherwise. That is to say, even though Bob denies it, I think he is angry at Bill, and so we need to figure out how to perhaps change Bob's feelings. Now, if that kind of thing is possible, then it seems that Bob's knowledge of his own emotions is perhaps not like Bob's knowledge of his own experiences. That's a mouthful, so let me say that again. Bob's awareness of what's going on with him in terms of his emotions might not be so privileged, might not be so asymmetrical, whereas Bob's awareness of what's going on with his own sensations, his own experiences, and perhaps also with his cognitive states, may be, in the traditional philosophical sense, asymmetrical or privileged. One big topic for us this term is going to be to try to figure out the ways in which modern, for example, psychology has been trying to challenge traditional philosophical views about how we are, according to which we're very good authorities in what's going on with us in all aspects of our minds and selves. Maybe that's not quite right. Maybe that's overrated. Maybe that while there are some areas of our self-knowledge, for example, knowledge of cognitive states and knowledge of experiences, on which we are specially authoritative, maybe it's not quite true for emotions and moods. So that's one thing. Another dimension I want you to keep in mind is that for character traits, many people would say you're far and away the best authority on what kind of character traits you've got. So, for example, maybe you think that you're brave, but only find out when the going gets rough, when it's time to show your true colors, that actually you're not. And you didn't know that beforehand. And in fact, perhaps other people watched you behave that way and found out even before you did that you're not as brave as you thought you were. Or maybe you think you're generous. Maybe you think you're empathetic or sympathetic or kind, and other people might have a different story about you entirely. I'm not trying to criticize anybody, I'm not trying to offend anybody, but psychologists have been telling us with a lot of evidence of late that people are not very good judges of their own characters. And in fact, many people are perhaps worse judges of their own characters than other people are who know them reasonably well. So one thing we'll be watching out for is the extent to which you are perhaps not the best judge of various things inside of you, or the extent to which you are. We're going to be trying to figure out how far that privileged access reaches as part of our study into the nature of self-knowledge. So one thing I'd like you to do after we're done with this lecture, after this one little segment is over, is I'd like you to get out a piece of paper or a place on your computer on which to do a little bit of writing and make a list of what you take to be the most important aspects of your character. Remember, these are dispositional types of traits. Things like being generous or kind, being irascible, being short-tempered, being impatient with fools, for example, are all different things we can say about one another's characters. I'd like you to write down a list of about 20 traits that you think are characteristic of you. Put that in a safe place. Don't necessarily show it to anybody just yet. I'll be asking you to do something else with that soon. But make yourself a list and put it in a safe place. Reflect on it. Ask yourself whether those are the things that you think are pretty accurate characterizations of you. And we'll get back soon to think about whether or not that list that you've made about yourself is accurate, whether it's missing some things, maybe involves a little bit of spin, so to speak, which is try to make a rosier picture of yourself than is really justified by the evidence. We'll see what we can learn about that possible distortion that you might have made of your own knowledge of yourself. See you soon.